History is shaped by decisions, some heroic, some catastrophic, but a few are so controversial, so shrouded in debate, that they leave permanent scars on the nations that made them. What happens when fear justifies injustice? When war is waged on a lie? When leaders gamble with lives in the name of victory? From the skies over Hiroshima to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to the shores of Cuba, these 6 decisions changed history forever. Some were called necessary, others unforgivable, but one thing is certain, no one walks away from them unscathed. This is the story of America's most controversial military decisions. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. In August 1945, the United States made one of the most consequential and controversial military decisions in history by dropping atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This decision was driven by the desire to bring a swift end to World War II, as Japan showed no signs of surrendering despite suffering heavy losses. The Manhattan Project, a top-secret research effort, had successfully developed the world's first nuclear weapons, and President Harry S. Truman faced the immense responsibility of deciding whether to use them. By mid-1945, Japan's economy and military were severely weakened, but its leadership refused to accept the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. The alternative to using nuclear weapons was a full-scale invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, which military planners estimated could result in millions of casualties on both sides. Faced with this grim prospect, Truman approved the use of the atomic bomb, believing it would bring a decisive end to the war. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy. At 8:15 a.m. it was dropped over Hiroshima, a key military and industrial center. The explosion instantly killed an estimated 80,000 people, with tens of thousands more succumbing to injuries and radiation poisoning in the following months. The sheer magnitude of destruction was unprecedented. Buildings were vaporized, people's shadows were seared onto walls, and fires raged through the city, consuming everything in their path. 3 days later, on August 9, another B-29 bomber Boxcar dropped a second bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. The terrain of Nagasaki lessened the immediate impact, but the bombs still killed around 40,000 people instantly, with the death toll rising to over 70,000 by the end of the year. The bombings had the intended effect. Japan surrendered on August 15, officially ending World War II. However, the decision to use atomic weapons remains one of the most debated military actions in history. Supporters argue that the bombings saved millions of lives by preventing a prolonged ground invasion, which would have resulted in catastrophic casualties for both American and Japanese forces. They also contend that Japan's surrender prevented the Soviet Union from expanding its influence in East Asia. Critics, however, argue that Japan was already on the brink of surrender, particularly after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August. They believe the bombings were unnecessary and inhumane, targeting civilian populations with an unprecedented level of destruction. The ethical implications of nuclear warfare, as well as the long-term effects on survivors, many of whom suffered from cancer, birth defects, and psychological trauma, continue to spark debate to this day. The bombings not only marked the end of World War II, but also ushered in the nuclear age, raising existential questions about the morality and consequences of wielding such power. The Vietnam War draft and conscription policies, 1960s-1973. The Vietnam War was one of the most divisive conflicts in American history, and its draft system became a focal point of public outrage and resistance. As the war escalated in the 1960s, government relied on conscription to maintain troop levels, drafting hundreds of thousands of young men to serve in a conflict that many viewed as unnecessary and unwinnable. The selective service system determined eligibility, with draft lotteries assigning numbers based on birthday. While some Americans believed it was their duty to serve, others saw the draft as unfair and discriminatory. Wealthier individuals could often avoid service through college deferments, medical exemptions, or connections, while working-class and minority groups were disproportionately drafted. This inequality fueled widespread protests, particularly among students and civil rights activists, who viewed the draft as a tool that forced the poor and marginalized into combat while the privileged remained safe at home. The draft system, which had been in place since World War II, became increasingly unpopular as casualties mounted and the war effort appeared directionless. Young men who opposed the war faced difficult choices: serve in a war they believed was unjust, flee the country to places like Canada, or face prison for draft evasion. Many anti-war demonstrators burned their draft cards in defiance, a powerful symbolic act that often led to arrest. The government responded with harsh penalties, sentencing some draft resistors to years in prison. Meanwhile, deferments and exemptions were exploited by those with influence, creating a class divide in military service. The most infamous example of this disparity was the fact that black and working-class men were disproportionately sent to the front lines, while many upper-class white men, including future political figures, found ways to avoid service. Public opposition to the war grew exponentially after events like the Tet Offensive in 1968, which revealed that the U.S. government had misled the public about the war's progress. Graphic television coverage of the war and reports of atrocities, such as the My Lai Massacre, further fueled anti-war sentiment. Universities became hubs of protest, with students organizing massive demonstrations and sit-ins. Some protests turned violent, most notably the Kent State University shooting in 1970, where National Guardsmen opened fire on student protesters, killing 4. The draft had become one of the most visible symbols of government overreach in the war's deep unpopularity. In response to the growing resistance, the Nixon administration introduced the concept of Vietnamization, aiming to gradually withdraw American troops while strengthening the South Vietnamization. Simultaneously, the draft system underwent reforms, including a lottery system intended to make conscription more equitable. However, the damage was done. The draft had already alienated a generation and intensified domestic unrest. Finally, in 1973, withdrew from Vietnam. The draft officially ended in the military transition to an all-volunteer force. The legacy of the Vietnam draft is still felt today, serving as a cautionary tale about government authority, social inequality, and the consequences of military intervention. The war and its draft policies left lasting scars on American society, deepening distrust in the government and fueling debates about military ethics that continue to shape public discourse. The invasion of Iraq 2003 and the search for WMD led invasion of Iraq in 2003 remains one of the most controversial military decisions in modern history, driven by claims that the Iraqi government possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and posed a threat to global security. Following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the George W. Bush administration pursued an aggressive foreign policy under the doctrine of preemptive war, arguing that nations harboring terrorists or developing WMDs needed to be neutralized before they could strike. The administration asserted that Saddam Hussein, Iraq's longtime dictator, had continued to develop chemical, biological, and possibly nuclear weapons in violation of United Nations sanctions. U.S. intelligence, along with reports from international agencies, suggested Iraq had an active WMD program, although there was no conclusive proof. Secretary of State Colin Powell made the case for war before the United Nations in February 2003, presenting evidence of alleged WMD facilities and ties between Iraq and terrorist organizations, particularly Al. Despite skepticism from some world leaders and the lack of UN authorization, the US and its allies, primarily the United Kingdom, launched Operation Iraqi Freedom on March 20. The initial phase of the invasion was swift, with UN and coalition forces quickly overwhelming the Iraqi military. By April 9, Baghdad had fallen, and on May 1, President Bush delivered his infamous Mission Accomplished speech aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, declaring an end to major combat operations. However, the situation soon deteriorated as the country plunged into chaos. No WMDs were found, leading to widespread criticism that the war had been based on faulty or manipulated intelligence. The lack of a post-invasion plan exacerbated problems. As Iraq's infrastructure collapsed, sectarian violence erupted and insurgent groups gained power. The U.S. decision to disband the Iraqi army and remove Ba'ath Party officials from government created a power vacuum that fueled further instability. Former Iraqi military personnel and disenfranchised Sunni groups joined extremist factions, including what would later become the Islamic State. The war became a prolonged and costly occupation, with over 4,400 American troops killed and tens of thousands wounded. Iraqi civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with millions displaced from their homes. The conflict also strained U.S. relations with allies and undermined trust in government institutions, as it became clear that Iraq had no active WMD program. In 2007, President Bush ordered a troop surge to stabilize the country, but by then public opinion had turned sharply against the war. The financial cost of the conflict exceeded $2 trillion, further fueling debates over its justification. In 2011, President Barack Obama officially withdrew U.S. forces, leaving behind a fragile Iraqi government and a region still plagued by violence. The war's legacy remains highly contentious, with many viewing it as a strategic blunder that destabilized the Middle East, empowered Iran, and gave rise to extremist groups. The invasion of Iraq is often cited as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intelligence failures, the consequences of military intervention without a clear exit strategy, and the long-term repercussions of regime change. The Bay of Pigs invasion 1961 and its failure. The Bay of Pigs invasion stands as one of the most embarrassing and controversial military failures in U.S. history. The operation, orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency (CIA), under the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, was a covert attempt to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Since taking power in 1959, Castro had aligned himself with the Soviet Union, nationalized American-owned businesses, and implemented socialist policies that alarmed the U.S. government. The Cold War rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union heightened tensions, and Washington viewed Castro as a major threat in the Western Hemisphere. The CIA, with approval from President Dwight D. Eisenhower, devised a plan to train Cuban exiles for a military invasion aimed at sparking a popular uprising that would depose Castro. When John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited the plan and, despite reservations, authorized the operation with modifications. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and funded by the CIA landed at the Bay of Pigs, a swampy area on Cuba's southern coast. However, the invasion was doomed from the start due to poor planning, inadequate intelligence, and a series of miscalculations. The U.S. had expected the Cuban people to rise against Castro, but instead his forces quickly mobilized and crushed the invader. The Cuban military, supported by Soviet-supplied weapons and intelligence, outmaneuvered the exile forces, killing or capturing most of them within 3 days. One of the biggest failures was the lack of adequate air support. Kennedy, wary of direct U.S. military involvement, canceled a crucial airstrike that could have neutralized Castro's air force before the invasion began. Without air cover, the exiles were left vulnerable to Cuban counterattack. The invasion force also struggled with logistical issues, including difficulties landing on the beaches and a lack of reinforcements. The failure of the Bay of Pigs had immediate and far-reaching consequences. For the U.S., it was a major humiliation on the world stage, exposing weaknesses in its intelligence operations and military planning. Kennedy publicly took responsibility for the failure, but the debacle damaged his administration's credibility and emboldened America's enemies. The failed invasion also strengthened Castro's position, allowing him to portray himself as a defender of Cuban sovereignty against U.S. aggression. It pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, leading directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came to the brink of nuclear war. The invasion further fueled anti-American sentiment in Latin America, reinforcing perceptions of the U.S. as an imperialist power, willing to meddle in the affairs of sovereign nations. In the years that followed, the U.S. continued efforts to undermine Castro's regime through covert operations, economic sanctions, and assassination attempts, but none succeeded in removing him from power. The Bay of Pigs remains a textbook example of how poor intelligence, flawed strategic assumptions, and political hesitation can lead to military disaster. It serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of underestimating an opponent, and the consequences of intervening in foreign conflicts without a clear, well-executed plan. The internment of Japanese Americans during WWII, 1942-1945. One of the most controversial and shameful military decisions in U.S. history was the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, fear and paranoia gripped the nation. Many Americans, particularly on the West Coast, believed that individuals of Japanese descent, regardless of citizenship status, could be potential spies or saboteurs. Under mounting political pressure, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, authorizing the removal of Japanese Americans from designated military areas, and placing them in internment. Though the order did not explicitly mention Japanese Americans, it was applied almost exclusively to them. Over 120,000 people, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, were forcibly relocated from their homes and sent to camps in remote areas of California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Arkansas, and Idaho. The internment process was swift and brutal. Families were given only days to pack their belongings, often forced to sell their homes, businesses and possessions at a fraction of their value. Upon arrival at the camps, internees were met with harsh conditions, barracks with no insulation, inadequate food and extreme weather conditions. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, effectively turning them into prison facilities. Despite these injustices, many Japanese Americans sought to prove their loyalty by enlisting in the U.S. The 4042nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, became one of the most highly decorated units in U.S. military history, fighting valiantly in Europe while their families remained imprisoned back home. The internment of Japanese Americans was justified by the government as a wartime necessity, but no evidence of widespread espionage or sabotage was ever found. In 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the policy in Korematsu, United States, ruling that national security concerns outweighed individual rights. However, as the war neared its end, the government began dismantling the camps, and internees were gradually released in 19. Many returned to find their homes and businesses destroyed or taken over by others. In the decades that followed, internment was widely condemned as a violation of civil liberties. In 1980, government formally apologized and granted reparations of $20,000 to each surviving internee under the Civil Liberties Act, acknowledging that the policy was based on racial prejudice rather than actual security threat. The internment of Japanese Americans remains a stark reminder of how fear and wartime hysteria can lead to gross injustices, violating the very democratic principles the country claims to uphold. The My Lai Massacre and its cover-up. 1968. The My Lai Massacre is one of the darkest and most controversial events of the Vietnam War, exposing the brutality of U.S. military operations and sparking outrage both domestically and internationally. On March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers from the 23rd Infantry Division, known as Charlie Company, entered the small village of My Lai in South Vietnam. Under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, the soldiers were tasked with seeking out Viet Cong fighters and sympathizers. However, instead of engaging in combat, they carried out a massacre, systematically killing between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children and the elderly. Many victims were brutally executed. In reports of rape and other atrocities later emerged, the soldiers faced no resistance, as the village consisted mostly of farmers who had no ties to the Viet Cong. The massacre lasted several hours, with entire families being slaughtered, homes burned, and bodies left in ditches. Initially, the military attempted to cover up the incident. Official reports falsely claimed that U.S. forces had engaged in a fierce battle with Viet Cong fighters and that civilian casualties had been minimal. However, in 1969, a former soldier, Ron Redenauer, who had heard about the massacre from fellow troops, sent letters to Congress and military officials demanding an investigation. Journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story to the public, revealing the horrific details of the massacre and the attempted cover-up. The revelations caused an international outcry and intensified anti-war sentiment in the United States, further eroding public support for the Vietnam War. In response to the scandal, the U.S. military conducted an internal investigation, leading to the court-martial of Lieutenant William Calley. He was charged with the murder of 22 villagers and found guilty and originally sentenced to life in prison. His punishment was later reduced to 20 years. And he ultimately served only 3.5 years under house arrest. The leniency of his sentence sparked further outrage, as many believed justice had not been served. Other officers involved in the massacre either had their charges dropped, or were never prosecuted. The My Lai Massacre exposed the brutal realities of the Vietnam War, and the failures of military leadership. It highlighted the dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians, the lack of accountability within the chain of command, and the moral dilemmas faced by soldiers in war zones. The event also fueled broader debates about U.S. foreign policy, war crimes, and the ethical conduct of the military. In the years that followed, My Lai became a symbol of the dark side of war, and the importance of transparency and accountability in military operations. The massacre remains a sobering reminder of how war can lead to horrific acts when soldiers operate without oversight or moral restraint. History is filled with decisions that shaped the world for better or worse, but which of these do you think was the most controversial? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden truths of history, psychology and philosophy, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Veil.
so you never miss a deep dive into the forces that shape our world.